Okay, so our first speaker is pretty well qualified. He's a consultant in orthopaedic and sports medicine at the Mater Private and Kappa National Orthopaedic Hospital, which obviously qualifies him to be here. But beyond that, he's also an All-Ireland winner, both as player and manager. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Pat O'Neill.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank, starting on a domestic basis, the Medical and Scientific Welfare Committee of the GEA and the GEA in its broader sense for this invitation to present to you in relation to the GEA and its relationship with concussion and how it manages. I first of all have to say that it's an evolving situation, and as we'll see during the day, there'll be certainly those parameters to it. Secondly, I would like to welcome the experts that have come from the World Centre involved in the world leader in concussion and head injury management in sport from the University of Pittsburgh Medical Centre, and who have joined up with the Bon Secours group here in Ireland, where there are a number of hospitals who are looking at developing clinics with a view to having access for patients, players in our context, for dealing with concussion, which is a very topical, hot and debated and controversial issue. But that doesn't take away from the fact that we have to manage it. So in progressing along, you may ask, well, what are you doing here? And this is Croke Park today, this morning as we're here, and it's a bright autumn evening. And this is the way it was this time last week, actually, or a few hours later. It was a very different place with a lot more people in it. Gaelic Games, as we know, to the domestic population, that it involves two particular sports, which are quite different from one another, but have certain areas in common. Football, Gaelic football as it's known as, and hurling, and of course it crosses the genders as well, and there are sister organisations that take care of that, but under the whole Gaelic Games umbrella. We've had American football here, just for American purposes, so it's not totally confined to Gaelic Games. Intermittently, we have had the American football teams here, and also while the Aviva Stadium was being developed, we had rugby and soccer here as well. The Medical and Scientific Committee of the GEA is made up of quite a mix of individuals, all with varying expertise, chaired by Ger Ryan, who is a non-medical person, but that is probably a very good thing to deal with keeping the spaces between medical and allied medical people and keeping them organised. So it's a good way of running a committee. And that has been very successful over the last two lives of this particular committee. There's medical specialists, team doctors, exercise physiologists, dietitians, physiotherapists, psychologists, and coaches and teachers. And there's also the facility to invite people in to discuss particular matters. We recently had an issue with regards to face guards for hurling and eye injuries, and we invited in an ophthalmologist, a professor of ophthalmology, to advise on that. As we know, there's varying degrees of head injury, and the concussion is the one that if there's mild traumatic head injury, well, that's pretty, from a diagnostic point of view, can be dealt with and identified, and the appropriate thing. It's this grey zone that comes into concussion that causes us all the concern, and then the more protracted entity of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and then some other related head injuries. So they come under that broad spectrum. You may well ask, what am I doing here, talking about concussion, as it comes under the auspices of neurology primarily, or neurosurgery, but it does involve a lot of other people, and particularly those in sport, because sport involves a lot of practitioners, both medical and allied medical, And in order to deliver it, we have to keep everybody in the loop as regards this. So I spend most of my time on the musculoskeletal end of things and not on the neurological side of things. But you may ask, why am I here? The reason being is that I was asked, because I'm a former player who has suffered concussions, and I was a manager and a coach of some sort, who had to make decisions from a managerial point of view and colour that with a medical point of view, which was the third component. So that may give some justification for I being on the podium here this morning on behalf of the GEA. My own experiences with it go back to when I was a schoolboy, and I got a knock out playing football, crashed into a fella, not my fault of course, and then was a little bit dazed, played on for about 10 minutes, the game ended, came back in, it was time to get back into study, and on the way in we had the luxury, even though this is 40 years ago, I hate to admit, of a swimming pool, so you could have your shower and get into the swimming pool, and I thought that might be a way to freshen up after this knock. But with a little bit of jig acting on the side of the pool, I slipped again and fell and banged my head fairly severely, so I was pretty well rattled at that stage, but managed to get up and without getting getting anybody else too excited about it, went up to study, and about 5 minutes into study, my mathematics copybook was splattered with vomit. So that was the starting role of it. So anyway, I ended up in the infirmary there, and over 48 hours, without any medical attention other than good nursing care from Mother Camillus, recovered. My next one was in a commemoration match, which was the 50th anniversary of the match that happened here between Tipperary and Dublin, the so-called Bloody Sunday, when a number of players and supporters were shot here in Croke Park. So this was a commemoration thing. My next recollection of it, about 5 minutes after half-time, was in Jervis Street Casualty Department some hours later, where I had run into a former Tipperary player who was primarily a hurler and ended up with a concussion. So luckily they were the only two concussions I've had in a reasonably extended career in terms of the playing of the game. My next involvement was as a player, was being a team player and being also the team doctor. I mean, I looked here last week and I saw the medical and support teams for the games, and I counted 20 for the Dublin team, and I think it was 16 for the Mayo team when they were all together. In this year, which is not that long ago, it's only 40 years ago, you had to double up as a player and a team manager. Now I was fortunate that there was another medical colleague on the team with us as well. And the same applied in terms of the UCD team that I involved in, and I had the pleasure of playing with some they say that political terrorists work in cells. Well, this was a kind of a sports terrorist group that was here. Unfortunately, one is recently deceased, but so that was the involvement. And then the third phase of it was when I was a manager with the Dublin team in the early 90s, and you can see here some of the effects of chronic traumatic encephalopathy being various manifestations, actually. So, moving on to the more realistic stuff, we have had these international conferences on concussion, and they have put some sort of organisation on the issues with regards to concussion in sport, but they've also raised a lot of issues and controversies, as we'll probably hear in the course of the day. There's one imminent next month in Berlin, and this publication here was what most people that were involved in it's the British Journal of Sports Medicine, but it was published in the so-called Zurich one, but it's imminent again. It's coming in Berlin now as well. But as I said to you, there are issues and controversies, and not everybody is in agreement. So this is a big event to help here today to try and help certainly the GEA and any other sports organisations, particularly the field sports organisations, equestrian, and I presume boxing would come into it as well. So maybe we'll have the Croke Park Agreement in a non-industrial fashion here in relation to concussion. The critical thing here is the recognition of it, and this proves the most urgent one, certainly in my book and my experiences in dealing with it, in the recognition of it and making a decision in the immediate situation. There is a little time frame in getting to the management of it subsequently, once the decision is made and they're removed from play. The GEA concussion guidelines are based on what we feel is international best Congress. And these are all flushed out regularly by the medical and scientific committees and any invited people that come to it. The deliverance of medical services, and this particularly in these urgent or critical ones that can occur where there's a severe injury and particularly a head injury, is very difficult, is very different when you see the variance that can occur in that we have different facilities. It's fine, you can see all the personnel that you have in a stadium like this, but if you venture down into rural Ireland, and this is one of the islands off in Clew Bay, where they have this field, it's a different scenario. Now, in between, you have all variants of that. So the availability of one, facilities, and secondly, expertise, and then access to further medical centres can vary quite significantly in these scenarios. So for that reason, there has to be some sort of a consensus rather than an elite decision-making process for managing this concussion issue and other critical injuries. In attendance at Gaelic Games, the figure that's bandied about, and I would take it that anecdotally that it's pretty right, it's about 95% there's healthcare professionals available, and that would be medical and allied medical, and that would include chartered physiotherapists, athletic trainers and nurses, and other people like EMT people as well. There has to be involvement of other people in this, and the critical people here, the most important subject matter, of course, are the players, and of course it can be at juvenile and adult level, parents and teachers, because it can be an issue in terms of schools, and also in underage coaching. Doctors, physiotherapists and allied professions I've alluded to, the Gaelic Players Association, which is the representative body for players and come under the umbrella of the association itself. And I believe a very critical group is the next group, which is referees and match officials. Now, there has been a little bit of aversion to them getting involved because of responsibilities, feeling they have enough responsibilities without adding medical responsibilities to them. But they are in a position really to judge, and they have really come on board in terms of the association. And of course then the obvious ones of the club and county administrators and the central management groups of Corla Bonishti and the Ard Corlia. And just briefly to run through some of the guidelines, keeping them as simply as we can. The concussion is a brain injury that needs to be taken serious, and the GEA does take it serious and is very concerned in it. It wouldn't be in this position here today delivering this type of a symposium without it being seriously concerned about it in terms of the management, both the immediate and the long-term management of players. The mantra being that any player suspected of having, and it's the word being suspected being the key word here, should be removed immediately from the plead and should not return to play on the same day. Now, there can be some debate and variance about that, and we'll allude to that just later on in the discussion. Where a team doctor is present, she should advise the person in charge of the team, i.e. the team manager, coach or somebody responsible for the team in this regard, and that a player must not be allowed to continue his participation in that game. Certainly at underage level and in school situations, that can sometimes be an issue. Concussion is an evolving injury, so what might seem fine after what is a major incident, potentially head injury incident, and there may well be this so-called lucid period, and then they have this evolving situation. So it's important that for a period of 24 to 48 hours that there is some monitoring in some form or fashion and awareness of these individuals. To date, the concussion diagnosis is a clinical judgment, and that is the stress thing. There has been some assistance from the Sports Concussion Assessment Tool, which is a clinical symptom and clinical finding protocol. It's coming under some, first of all, it's coming under review because of some issues with it. It's not the easiest tool to use in a particular, and how it can be used in the acute situation is certainly debatable in our estimation. Players suspected of having should have adequate rest, and again, this is an area that is coming under question as to whether there should be some sort of return to active activity or controlled active activity, and I think we'll hear some very emerging science on that later in today's discussion. Players up to the age of 18 years of age should have a 2-week period of rest and then should follow a gradual return to play protocol. That's as we exist at the moment, but as I've said earlier, these are potentially can be changed and will be reviewed in terms of the context of what we hear here today and what comes out of the international consensus meeting as well. And players have to receive medical clearance by a doctor. Now, this again creates issues because it may be the local family practice doctor, it may be the team doctor, and there may not be a team doctor, depending on the level of team involved, or depending how rural it is. So this can be an issue, and this is where maybe some access to concussion clinics may be of value. Implementing the policy. In 2007, the GE was one of the first organisations in Ireland, because they took it serious from the very beginning, to issue a position statement on concussion, and this was subsequently updated when the committees rolled in 2013 and 2015. The Medical Scientific Welfare Committee of the GEA devised a multifaceted education programme in 2004, which aimed at the transfer of knowledge to players, who are the key people, coaches, parents, referees, administrators, and medical personnel regarding concussion guidelines. The GEA has collaborated with other sporting bodies, acquired brain injury, who came to the GEA, and they engaged readily with them and even got some publications together to raise the awareness of this in terms of promoting the issues and about the proper management of concussion. Workshops have been delivered. There's been roadshows which have workshop delivered to coaches, medical personnel and referees both at club and inter-county level. And now there is a 20-minute GEA specific e-learning programme for players and coaches, and that's available on the GEA website, and it's very nicely put together. The national referees, I've alluded to the referees, they have come on board and are supported, and there has been a concussion awareness workshop at the National Referees Conference, and that's very important, as I've said earlier, to have the referees on board. And of course the GEA continues to collaborate with various bodies and agencies, both national and international, in this regard, and today is a very good example of that. The challenges that we have with it, difficulty in excluding the diagnosis of concussion. That's critical in this emergency situation. Already, we've said the doctors and physiotherapists are present only at 5% of games, so they're not present in 5% of it, so you depend on people that have had the education in concussion that there are issues, and if there's any doubt, we remove them, as they said. And sometimes we have the issue of untrained professionals or personnel eliminating the diagnosis and saying there's no problem, play on, and that is a recipe for disaster, or potential disaster anyway. And of course you can get players in denial. They don't want to come off, they're probably not cognitively capable of making a rational decision at the time if there has been a concussion, and yet they will argue and sometimes physically resist being taken off, and again, depending on where and what level that occurs, it may be difficult to implement. And then you have the other side of it, where you may get players play acting and feigning injury, which makes it even more complicated. And that may be because they want to get the opposing player involved in it, sent off. So it's a difficult one in terms of trying to decide. And one that occurs in this country is that juvenile players, young players that are involved in multi-sports, they may be across a number of sports, so they may have a concussion today playing Gaelic football, and they may play rugby or soccer tomorrow or basketball, or they may be involved in horse riding or gymkhana tomorrow. So there's the potential, and there's no link up, so you don't know what's going on. At least if it's within the single sport, it can be dealt with. And of course, coaches, the most important thing is win, win, win. Without a thing, so they abdicate their responsibility, and of course they may feel they don't have to take responsibility. Then we always have to be concerned in that situation of this so-called fatal second impact syndrome. Challenges, the education, successfully targeting the proper people in relation to it, and what happens if guidelines are ignored. Suppose there's an issue, both a medical issue, and if we go further afield, medical-legal issue, legal issues that can follow down the road, and we are seeing that evolving, not in Gaelic games as such, but we have seen it in other sports. And then a major one of contention, which is one of contention in the GEA, is this of a substitution. It has been applied at the elite level, rugby, but it's not. I'll allude to it further on just before we end. And the reporting of injuries and monitoring of players that have had concussions is important, and this brings in this thing of a whole injury database, and again the issue of players involved. With regards to the substitute, in the annual Congress, which is a big event, a couple of thousand people at it every year, it was held in Cavan in 2015, there was a motion to Congress which was proposed the introduction of a temporary substitute to allow a player suspected of concussion to be removed from play on the instruction of the referee, tested for concussion and allowed to return to play following a negative result to the sideline concussion test. The Congress didn't want to make a decision, or decided it would be better dealt with by the Medical Scientific Welfare Committee for consideration. So it came back for assessment, and the decision was that the GEA should not introduce a concussion substitute, and that the current guidelines continue to be applied with ongoing monitoring and for review by the Medical and Medical Scientific Welfare Committee as required. And this would be part of this review, what's going on here today. The focus of the GEA with regards to concussion should be the continued education of all members and stakeholders involved in it. The other matter, which was a spin-off on that, was as to whether there was a requirement for an independent medical officer separate from either teams to do that, and that wasn't felt that the team doctors or medical personnel or allied medical personnel dealing with players were in a better position to know the player and know their attitudes and their form, and that they would be in a better position to do that. Again, that's something for consideration. The GEA has engaged with the Government Joint Commission on Health and Children, who have had a conference in December. I think it was finalised. Well, I think it was in October, but the report came in December of 2014. And Jerry Ryan, chairman of the Medical Committee, and Sean Moffat, who initiated most of the initial guidelines on behalf of the GEA, presented to the Government Committee on that. And I think they proposed that a task force be set up in dealing with concussion in sport. And on the back of that, there have been interactions from the public health sections of the Department of Health and Children in this regard, so that's an ongoing matter. Now, I'm not going to go through all this, but they have created a report which is very interesting reading, and it's very, very comprehensive. So I would encourage you, it's readily available on the thing, and it's quite well put together. Now, it doesn't solve the problems, but it certainly raises all the issues. So it is a very good 14-point plan that they have put together there. So it is readily available on the Oireachtas reports online. And I would encourage you, anybody that's interested, and we're all interested if we're here today, to have a look at it. The GEA made a number of recommendations, and I'm not going to go into them in detail, but they followed more or less the guidelines, and certainly the GEA presentations were very well received and accepted in terms of what was being done by the GEA to deal with concussion, and also outlining issues and where government and their agencies could also come in. The aspirations is that every player at club and county level have an understanding of the consequences, and to emphasise that there's a need for personal responsibility of players in this thing, and this is where the GPA, the Gaelic Players Association, come into it. The education of all these stakeholders, the players, the parents, coaches and schools, with regards to concussion, with a particular emphasis on the dangers of a second injury, second impact session. And the emphasis that to reassure that it's not of a major incidence in Gaelic games, but that it is a serious issue should it arise. So that reassurance must be given, because the last thing we want in this current climate, with all the comorbidity that goes with obesity and inactivity and all that, is to stop people playing sport, and certainly for the Gaelic Athletic Association to stop them playing Gaelic games. And clubs to have an education programme and a designated offer and a concussion register, and that would feed into the National Injury Register, which is being developed at the moment. The resources, there's a list of the resources that are available to coaches or anybody dealing with players at this level. I won't go through it in any detail. There are a number of posters and online advisory things, and they're well laid out. Again, they may need updating from time to time, and they're all readily available. One of the places that the GA found that is of most useful are posters in the dressing rooms, or where there's changing going on, because they're there, they're chatting about it, and they'll talk about it and all that. Better than even on apps or on online. They're there where they're doing their activities, or in the tea room or in the meeting room, and these have proven very, and in conjunction with the GPA and Acquired Brain Injury Ireland, the GEA circulated these over the years and are in the process of updating them. Our young age group, we have to be very, very careful about them, because they are that much more vulnerable, and they're the ones that present. And I think we'll hear from Dr. Lynch later on this evening, as a paediatric neurologist who's developed an interest in the paediatric concussion, in managing these and the issues that these young players, and particularly young girls, can have in relation to head injury. The GPA, we are involved and have been very proactive in it. Dr. Jim O'Donovan is here today, and he represents the medical component of the GPA. And this is the online website which can be used. I think in getting to conclusion, I think it's important not to cross the line in terms of concussion, and the only crossing of the line should be off the line and out of it. So remove the player. And here we have classical examples of where this was undertaken. It's a medical decision, and it can be difficult, but if there's doubt, I think the message has to be remove them from the game, despite that may not be strategically or tactically what is required at the time. This is an incident, and this is a player that was concussed in the last 13 minutes, I believe, of the All-Ireland final in 1913, and was not substituted because the feeling was that he wasn't concussed, but there was also the issue that there was no remaining subs allowed for that 10 minutes, and it was a nip and tuck game. But however, it was worked out to be the right decision, because here he is 10 minutes after the end of the game, and I don't think there's too much evidence of concussion in that last picture. So, in conclusion, we've got to handle this with care. It's a delicate structure. It's different to a hamstring, even though they're the curse of our life, of what I deal with on a day-to-day basis. And we certainly don't want to be seeing the brains in this condition. It's too late when we get to this area, and of course we will hear some more talk about that later on. So, thank you very much.